Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Bonjour à tous et tous. We are joined by Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Jerry DeMarco. Once the opening remarks have finished, we will start with questions in the room before taking questions from the Zoom link. One question and one follow-up. Alors, nous allons commencer avec questions dans la salle, suivi par des questions sur la ligne, une question et une question en suivi. So, Commissioner, I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for joining me. I'm Jerry DeMarco, Canada's Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. Aujourd'hui, j'ai présenté au Parlement 5 rapports sur des programmes qui touchent les efforts. Aujourd'hui, j'ai présenté au Parlement 5 rapports sur des programmes qui touchent les efforts du gouvernement fédéral face à la crise climatique. L'automne dernier, j'ai fourni au Parlement un survol de la performance du Canada dans le dossier climatique et j'ai indiqué que des audits de programmes particuliers suivraient, comme ceux dont je vais parler aujourd'hui. Comme ces programmes sont en cours, mes rapports constituent une sorte de bulletin de mi-parcours qui devrait aider à améliorer les résultats, car le changement climatique ne s'arrête jamais. By auditing these programs at an early stage, our intent is to provide Parliament with useful information that can be used before the clock runs out. We cannot afford a fourth decade of failure on climate action. First, let's turn to carbon pricing, which is led by Environment and Climate Change Canada. As is recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada and many international organizations, effective carbon pollution pricing drives changes in consumer and producer behavior that in turn reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon pricing is therefore essential if Canada is to finally succeed in significantly reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. We found that the department had ensured that carbon pricing systems were in place in all provinces and territories. In 2021, the department worked to address weaknesses in its initial approach that had allowed some less effective provincial carbon pricing systems to be accepted. However, the department did not fully address some shortcomings that could hinder the overall effort to meet Canada's emission reduction targets. For example, we found that the federal requirements for large emitters continue to undermine the polluter pays principle by approving weaker systems for large emitters in some parts of the country. In addition, Indigenous communities and some groups in society remain disproportionately affected by carbon pricing systems. Il faut continuer d'améliorer l'approche du Canada pour la tarification du carbone afin d'appuyer l'atteinte des cibles nationales de réduction des émissions. Il faut notamment veiller à produire des rapports transparents qui permettront aux Canadiens et aux Canadiennes de mieux comprendre l'efficacité et les répercussions des systèmes de tarification du carbone. Le Canada s'est engagé à réduire progressivement sa dépendance sur le combustible fossile et à favoriser une économie à faible émission de carbone pour atteindre la carboneutralité d'ici 2050. Il s'est aussi engagé à assurer une transition équitable pour les collectivités et les travailleuses et travailleurs touchés par ce virage économique. C'est le sujet du deuxième audit publié aujourd'hui. La combustion du charbon pour produire de l'électricité contribue de façon importante aux émissions de GES. L'élimination progressive du charbon est une première étape du plan du gouvernement pour effectuer la transition vers une économie à faible émission de carbone. Le gouvernement avait désigné Ressources naturelles Canada à titre de ministère responsable de présenter une loi sur la transition équitable en 2019. En ce qui concerne l'appui à une transition équitable vers une économie à faible émission de carbone, le gouvernement n'était pas bien préparé et a été lent à agir. Le ministère a peu fait pour avancer le dossier avant 2021. Il n'avait pas établi de plan de mise en œuvre pour gérer ce virage économique important qui touche une diversité de travailleuses et de travailleurs, de collectivités, de régions et de parties prenantes. We found that as Canada shifts its focus to low-carbon alternatives, the government is not prepared to provide appropriate support to more than 50 communities and 170,000 workers in the fossil fuels sector. Without a proper just transition plan in place, there are risks that are comparable to what occurred with the collapse of the northern cod fishery in Atlantic Canada in the 1990s. In the absence of a coordinated federal approach to support a just transition to a low-carbon economy, federal organizations relied on existing mechanisms, such as social assistance programs. These fell short of achieving a just transition for coal workers and the communities where they live. As the coal phase-out is the first of several transitions to a low-carbon economy facing Canadian workers, communities, and governments, there is an opportunity for the federal government to learn from this initial experience to improve future policies and programs. The future will involve changes at a much larger scale than the coal phase-out, so it is essential for Canada to make up for lost time and ramp up its approach to a just transition. Le troisième rapport publié aujourd'hui porte sur l'hydrogène. À mesure que la place des combustibles fossiles diminue dans le mélange des énergies consommées au Canada, l'attention se tourne vers l'hydrogène à titre de solution plus propre. Si le Canada ne projette pas adéquatement l'incidence de l'hydrogène dans le contexte de la réduction des émissions de GES, la capacité à atteindre les cibles nationales de réduction pourrait souffrir. Les deux ministères, Environnement et Changement climatique Canada et Ressources naturelles Canada, souscrivent à l'idée de cette source d'énergie propre. Mais ils ont adapté des approches différentes pour évaluer le rôle que l'hydrogène devrait jouer dans l'atteinte des cibles de réduction des émissions. Environnement et Changement climatique Canada estime que l'hydrogène pourrait amener l'équivalent d'une réduction de 15 mégatonnes de GES d'ici 2030, tandis que Ressources naturelles Canada estime que cette réduction pourrait atteindre jusqu'à 45 mégatonnes sur le même horizon. In its transformative scenario, Natural Resources Canada assumed the adoption of aggressive and sometimes non-existent policies along with an ambitious uptake of new technology. In our view, the assumptions in the federal hydrogen strategy are overly optimistic and compromise the credibility of the projected emissions reductions. This is concerning because Canada's greenhouse gas emissions have increased significantly since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed in 1992, making Canada the worst performer of all G7 nations since that time. As I noted in the fall, Canada has consistently failed to meet its climate targets, despite numerous plans and commitments. Going forward, Canada needs realistic goals, credible plans, and most importantly, effective actions. If hydrogen is to be part of Canada's plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then Environment and Climate Change Canada and Natural Resources Canada will need to coordinate their approaches and more effectively model and communicate a pathway for hydrogen. Our fourth report is a snapshot of the Greening Government Strategy, launched by Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat in 2017. Federal government operations are a significant contributor to Canada's total emissions of greenhouse gases. We found that the Secretariat had taken initial steps to support departments' efforts to reduce the federal government's environmental footprint. However, 5 years into the strategy, efforts to reduce emissions are not as complete as they could be. This is important given Canada's publicly stated commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and to be a national and global leader in transitioning to carbon-neutral government operations. At the time of our audit, 8 of 27 departments had created reduction plans covering 81% of departmental emissions. We looked at national defense, the largest emitter in government, and found that there was no clear information about how the department's efforts were contributing to the overall reduction target. The audit found that some important information on greening government was hard to find, unclear, or incomplete. There was also a lack of detail on costs and savings. And in addition, the emissions of Crown corporations were not part of the strategy. Overall, this lack of information makes it difficult for decision makers, Parliament, and Canadians to track whether the government will meet its 2050 target and whether Canada is actually being the global leader in greening government that it has set out to be. Il reste du travail à faire pour que la stratégie pour un gouvernement vert produise les résultats attendus et pour mettre en place des méthodes et des plans exhaustifs qui permettront de suivre la progression des réductions d'émissions et de rendre compte. Notre dernier audit a examiné si des programmes de financement sélectionnés avaient conduit à des investissements dans des infrastructures plus résilientes et inclusives et ayant une moindre intensité carbonique. Nous avons constaté qu'Infrastructure Canada avait conçu et mis en œuvre une façon d'évaluer si le projet financé était plus résistant aux effets des changements climatiques, comme les inondations et les feux de forêt qui deviennent plus fréquents, et s'il contribuait à réduire les émissions de GES. Dans la première version de l'optique de changement climatique, soit l'outil d'évaluation que le ministère a lancé en 2018, les gestionnaires de projets d'infrastructure devaient fournir des estimations détaillées des réductions d'émissions prévues en lien avec leur projet. Or, nous avons constaté que ces exigences avaient été abaissées lorsque l'optique de changement climatique a été révisée en 2021. Cela a eu pour conséquence de réduire la capacité du ministère à calculer la contribution des programmes de financement à l'atteinte des objectifs climatiques du gouvernement et en rendre compte. La détérioration de la qualité de l'information a été telle qu'Infrastructure Canada n'a pu établir avec exactitude les avantages prévus sur le plan de l'atténuation du changement climatique et de la résilience des projets qu'il finançait. Nous avons aussi constaté qu'Infrastructure Canada n'avait pas intégré les engagements du Canada envers les objectifs de développement durable des Nations unies dans la conception de ces programmes. Le ministère avait intégré l'analyse comparative entre les sexes plus dans la conception de ces programmes et recueilli des informations à ce sujet auprès des promoteurs de projets, mais elle n'avait pas mesuré ni déclaré de manière cohérente les résultats. S'il n'a pas d'informations fiables et complètes sur les avantages et les résultats attendus des projets financés, le gouvernement ne pourrait pas déterminer si ces investissements ont contribué à produire des infrastructures résilientes, à moindre intensité carbonique ou à atteindre ses engagements d'améliorer la diversité et l'inclusion. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, the climate change clock never stops ticking. We are moving ever closer to some critical deadlines that the government has set for itself. I trust the findings and recommendations that I have brought forward today will help the government improve its performance in these areas of critical importance. Because climate change is an intergenerational crisis with a rapidly closing window for action, it is essential for Canada to translate its commitments and plans into real actions and results. Our future depends on it. Thank you. Merci. I am now ready for your questions.
Thank you. We will begin with questions in the room. If you have a question on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. Nous allons commencer dans la salle. Si vous avez une question en ligne, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction lever la main. So we will start with David Thurton from the CBC.
Hi, Commissioner. Most of your comments about just transition were in French, so I'm just wondering, especially for us broadcast reporters that need brief clips, can you sum up what you found, what you discovered when it comes to the government's hope to implement a just transition for coal workers and its plans to do a just transition overall for workers in the oil and gas sector?
So on the just transition, which is a critically important initiative, the government has been slow off the mark, and they're unprepared for the transition to a low-carbon economy in terms of making sure that communities and workers are not left behind.
But it sounds like your report is saying that they did very little work, and whatever work they did was through existing programs. So essentially, are you saying that they really haven't done anything new?
So this audit looks at both the initial phase out of coal, and they relied mainly on existing programs, so there's not a lot new there. And it also looked at how well they're prepared for the upcoming larger transitions in Canada, and they're not well prepared. For example, the Just Transition Commitment came out of the Paris Agreement in 2015. It's now 2022, and we still don't have the Just Transition legislation or the regime or the governance structure to implement it. So they're very slow off the mark. And it's 7 years since they've had notice that they had to work on this. And it's disappointing to see how slowly they've been working.
Bonjour, Valérie Gamache de Radio-Canada. Je voudrais vous entendre sur la taxe carbone. La façon dont vous en parlez, c'est comme si on a l'impression que la taxe carbone, dans sa forme actuelle, est source d'injustice pour certains Canadiens.
Est-ce que vous pouvez répéter la question? Est-ce qu'on peut augmenter le volume un peu aussi?
Est-ce que vous arrivez à la conclusion que la taxe carbone est source d'injustice pour certains Canadiens? Vous parlez de communautés éloignées, de communautés autochtones. Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que cette taxe-là, finalement, je dirais, est injuste pour une partie de la population?
Oui, alors il y a des problèmes avec les étapes initiales du tarification du carbone. On donne des exemples dans le rapport avec des inégalités avec les effets de la tarification du carbone avec les communautés autochtones et les entreprises qui sont un peu moins larges que d'autres. Alors, une de nos recommandations est que le gouvernement évalue le programme pour assurer qu'il n'y a pas ces inégalités dans le fonctionnement de tarification de carbone, parce que ça doit être juste et équitable pour tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes, y compris les communautés autochtones, comme vous avez dit.
Et quand on parle de transition juste, est-ce que je comprends que pour le charbon, ça a été inefficace? Quand on regarde la transition qu'on s'apprête à faire pour le secteur pétrolier et gazier, est-ce que le gouvernement est en retard également? Pourriez-vous peut-être élaborer là, à quel point le gouvernement est en retard pour amorcer cette transition-là également?
Oui, alors la transition équitable en ce qui concerne le charbon continue. Ça a déjà commencé à Alberta et ça continue avec 3 autres provinces. Ça va prendre quelques années pour mettre en œuvre. Alors, c'est possible qu'ils peuvent apprendre des leçons du charbon en Alberta parce qu'ils n'ont pas été proactifs avec la transition équitable pour les premières étapes du charbon avec Alberta. Mais c'est essentiel parce que quand une porte est fermée, on a besoin de dire à la collectivité et les travailleuses et travailleurs qu'une autre porte va ouvrir et pour qu'ils sentent qu'ils ne vont pas être laissés de côté, avec la transition à la carboneutralité. Alors, c'est essentiel que le gouvernement rapidement mette en place une loi sur la transition juste et un système de gestionner ce dossier qui est très important pour beaucoup de communautés et de travailleurs et travailleuses partout dans le Canada, principalement dans 4 provinces avec le charbon, autre part pour les autres transitions qu'on va voir dans le futur.
Thanks. We'll go to Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press.
Good morning. In the hydrogen report, you've said that they used sort of ambitious understanding of modeling and that the modeling maybe was weak. I'm wondering if that extends beyond hydrogen, if you have concerns that the federal government's modeling they used overall for the emissions reduction report, for example, needs to be updated. If we can't trust the hydrogen modeling, how can we trust the rest of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because the initial focus of this audit was strictly on the hydrogen aspect. But as you see from the latter parts of the report, we started to see issues and concerns that could apply to their emissions reduction efforts in general. So this has to do with modeling, the assumptions used, the transparency of the modeling, as well as whether they're doing proper peer reviews of the model. So this overall question that it arose here because we were looking at hydrogen, but we decided to include that in the audit report because it does raise concerns about their overall approach to climate modeling and emissions reductions. We are happy that they have fully accepted our recommendations to improve that. We'll see whether they'll follow up those words with actions in terms of improving the modeling, the quality of the assumptions, and the transparency and scientific rigor of their modeling.
And I'm also curious, on the big emitters part of the carbon price, you said that it's weak, that it's undermining sort of the polluter pays principle. I'm wondering if that is only as it relates to the provincial big emitter programs that they've approved, or if that also applies to the federal government's own sort of backstop system for big emitters.
Yeah, so we've highlighted the fact that they've approved a couple of weak systems, Ontario's being an example, which may only achieve up to 1 megaton, even though they had projected initially 2.7. I'm going back to the figures from 2019 when I was working at the provincial level. There may be newer figures now, but it was surprising to see the federal government approve the Ontario Large Emitters Program because it is relatively weak. So but that's not the only issue. There's a question of fairness between the Federal Large Emitters Program, the OBPS as it's called, and the carbon levy that everyday Canadians pay, whether it's at the gas station or in their heating bill and so on. Right now, a large amount of the large emitters' emissions are not subject to the carbon levy for reasons of competitiveness and other questions around the notion of what's called carbon leakage. And however, it's not fair for everyday Canadians to shoulder a disproportionate amount of the burden in terms of the carbon levy. So we recommended that the government strengthen the large emitters approach, including its approach to approving or not approving provincial programs.
Thank you. Inès Lombardo de la Franco-Presse.
Thank you. Bonjour. Dans le premier rapport sur la transition équitable vers une économie à faible émission de charbon, il y a 10 recommandations du groupe de travail et le Canada n'en a suivi que 4. Il n'a même pas suivi la première qui pourtant a l'air d'être dans la mesure de ses moyens, qui est d'élaborer un plan de transition pour éliminer graduellement le charbon. Alors, moi, question toute simple, pourquoi est-ce que le Canada est incapable de suivre ce type de recommandation qui a l'air plutôt simple?
Pourquoi le Canada
est incapable de suivre cette recommandation-là, juste d'élaborer un plan de sortie graduelle?
Alors, ceci est une question pour le gouvernement, pourquoi ils sont incapables. Ils ne sont pas incapables de faire une transition juste. Si j'ai compris la question complètement, c'était un peu difficile à entendre, mais le Canada est capable à gérer une transition équitable pour les collectivités, les travailleurs et travailleuses. Jusqu'à maintenant, ils ne sont pas bien préparés. Je ne sais pas pourquoi ils ont pris si long de temps pour mettre en place une loi, un système et tout ça pour une transition équitable. Ça va faire leur travail plus difficile parce qu'il va y avoir plus de polarisation du débat si on ferme une porte, comme j'ai dit avant, comme si on ferme une porte avant d'ouvrir l'autre, ça peut défavoriser la communauté, les collectivités, les travailleurs et travailleuses, mais ça a aussi à l'effet qu'il n'y aura pas assez de support pour pour le programme. Alors, c'est important que le gouvernement rapidement met en place un système pour la transition équitable. S'ils sont sérieux avec la transition énergétique, la carboneutralité, ils ont besoin d'être sérieux avec la transition équitable pour les travailleurs, travailleuses et collectivités. Ils sont liés.
Ok, merci. Et vous avez aussi, dans ce même rapport-là, vous avez constaté qu'il y avait des programmes fédéraux, des mécanismes existants pour accompagner les travailleurs et les travailleuses, et qui, bien souvent, ils étaient inadaptés ou insuffisants pour aller vers la transition. Donc, vous avez recommandé de nouveaux programmes fédéraux, mais est-ce que vous pouvez donner des exemples de types de programmes ou des pistes qui pourraient mieux accompagner les travailleurs et les travailleuses?
Oui, on a une liste de programmes et de soutien qui sont requis et je vais consulter le rapport pour que je puisse ne pas manquer une. Alors, ils ont le soutien de revenus, ça c'est évident. Ils ont les occasions de perfectionnement des compétences, de formation et de recyclage professionnel. On a besoin des emplois bien rémunérés, y compris des emplois verts. On a besoin des aides, de les aider à retour à l'emploi. On a besoin de politiques sociales et de l'emploi équitable pour la diversité. Et aussi, on ne peut pas laisser de côté, on a besoin de la sécurité pour la retraite. Alors, il y a beaucoup d'exemples de qu'est-ce qu'on a besoin d'avoir dans une transition équitable. On ne peut pas seulement utiliser les autres programmes généraux pour ça. Et j'espère et je suis content que nos recommandations, les réponses qu'ils sont en accord avec nos recommandations. Alors j'espère que même après quelques années où il y avait peu à faire, peut-être maintenant on va voir une accélération de travail sur ce dossier qui est très important pour les Canadiens et les Canadiennes.
Thank you. We will now move to the Zoom link where we will start with Marika Walsh.
Hi there, it's Marika Walsh with the Globe and Mail. Commissioner, I just have a few follow-up questions for you. Just broadly, first of all, given the concerns you're raising around things like the credibility of projections, the fairness of policies, the effectiveness of policies by funding projects that we don't actually know will help to reduce emissions, I'm wondering to what extent you view these reports collectively as an indictment of the federal government greenwashing the true impact of its policies and plans.
Well, there are some features that go across two or more of the reports. One of them is the transparency question, which I think you're alluding to. Canada needs to be transparent, whether it's with respect to the disproportionate impacts of carbon pricing, whether transparent as to their modeling for emissions, transparent as to their assumptions for what is quite an optimistic view of hydrogen's potential between now and 2030. So yes, the Canadian government needs to be more upfront and transparent about its efforts. Having said that, you know, they are putting into place mechanisms that are, you know, proven to be successful in other areas. So carbon pricing, you know, it's been part of economic theory for 100 years now that you can address negative externalities with a price on whatever is generating the externality. In this case, it's production and consumption of fossil fuels. So that theory should work if they do a proper job at it. If they let large emitters off the hook and if they disproportionately affect Canadians in so doing, then they're going to make the challenge much harder. So we've made a lot of recommendations that talk about linking the effectiveness of the programs to transparency so that the numbers, not only the numbers add up, but they actually achieve the results, which was the theme of, as you know, of my fall reports. Canada's had no shortage of plans that add up on paper, and they've had no shortage of failures when it comes to the actual results, the latest of which, of course, was the numbers that came out 2 weeks ago for the 2020 target, which was not met, even with the large drop in emissions in 2020, which was the first year of COVID. So they've got to follow up their words with actions.
Okay, can you just clarify, when you say transparency, is it correct that what you actually mean is whether the policies they announce will actually do what they say they will do? And then my actual follow-up question is around the criticisms around hydrogen. I spoke with somebody in the AG's office, one of the technical officers, to explain it more. And he said that things like the clean technology tax credit, carbon capture storage tax credit, and the carbon price could actually mean that all of those policy elements are now in place to meet those more aggressive projections on hydrogen. So can you please be just very precise? When you say the hydrogen estimates are overly optimistic and compromise credibility, are you talking about the current suite of targets and policies, or are you talking about an old set?
So the report looked at Natural Resources Canada's strategy, which, as you know, projected up to 45 megatons in reductions related to hydrogen between now and 2030, and relied on overly optimistic assumptions and programs that are not in place. So we're saying that's overly optimistic. Even Environment Canada's projection of 15 was subject to assumptions that would not necessarily be considered conservative or realistic. So there are problems in both of the approaches. Natural Resources Canada's 45 megatons is an unrealistic number based on the current pathway. But remember, the strategy is overly optimistic, but it actually is looking at, in some ways, what really needs to be done to reach net zero. So their optimism is warranted in the sense that we do need to make major changes. Our criticism is that you can't just assume that those changes are going to happen. They need to be based on actual federal efforts to make those assumptions reality, as opposed to just pie in the sky assumptions that we would like to see but aren't in place. So it's a matter of matching up their assumptions with actual programs. And they could be right that this transformative scenario will happen, but they've got to actually put into place the programs to make that happen. They can't just release a strategy that says we hope it'll happen.
Our next question is from Émilie Bergeron.
Oui, bonjour. Dans votre rapport sur l'hydrogène, vous soulignez que les calculs n'étaient pas les mêmes pour Ressources naturelles Canada et chez Environnement Canada, de voir que les estimations, l'approche variait d'un ministère à l'autre au sein du même gouvernement. Comment vous expliquez ça et qu'est-ce qu'il faut corriger à l'avenir à ce sujet-là?
Alors, je ne peux pas l'expliquer. Je ne sais pas pourquoi il y a deux ministères avec le même accès à la même information, travaillent dans une manière indépendamment pour arriver à 45 mégatonnes et 15 mégatonnes. Ça, c'est une question pour eux. Mais qu'est-ce qu'on dit? C'est un plan, le plan pour réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, c'est un plan pour le fédéral. Le Canada en total. C'est pas raisonnable d'avoir deux différents ministères qui travaillent dans une manière différente avec leurs hypothèses, avec leurs projections et tout ça. On a besoin de savoir, OK, qu'est-ce que le Canada va faire ici et avoir tous les ministères qui sont impliqués travaillant ensemble. C'est un peu ridicule d'avoir deux bateaux qui passent dans la nuit, un avec Ressources naturelles Canada et un avec Environnement et Changement climatique Canada. Ils ont besoin de travailler ensemble et être réalistes avec leur hypothèse pour qu'ils puissent avoir un plan qui est solide et qui va atteindre les cibles.
Justement, dans vos recommandations, vous dites ça prend une nouvelle modélisation qui tient en compte plusieurs choses qui étaient absentes. Est-ce que, selon vous, il faut repartir de zéro carrément par rapport à ce qui a déjà été fait, ou il y a quand même certains éléments qui sont récupérables? Est-ce qu'il faut partir de zéro finalement?
Non, ils n'ont pas besoin de recommencer à zéro. Ils ont besoin d'améliorer leur système, d'avoir seulement un système pour le Canada et pas avec un par chaque ministère, mais ils n'ont pas besoin de retourner à zéro. Ils ont besoin d'améliorer leur approche et être réalistes avec leur hypothèse dans leur modèle de réduction des émissions. Et ça, c'est en ce qui concerne l'hydrogène et en ce qui concerne leur plan en général.
Our next question is from Dylan Robertson.
Hi, Commissioner. Thanks so much for taking our questions. I'd like to know what your reports tell us about these climate policies in rural Canada. It seems like the carbon tax rebates don't make up for the economic hit in the regions where basically you have to drive and fly. And you've got lots here about the green transition. So what is rural Canada going to face if the government doesn't change some of these policies?
So the question of disproportionate impacts is covered in the carbon pricing report, and you've also referred to the just transition as well. They're related but different reports. So it's very important from a fairness point of view and from an effectiveness point of view that people whose lives have been organized around human settlement patterns in rural areas and so on that are based on affordable access to energy and so on, that they aren't then disproportionately affected by a change in government policy that, for example, makes the price of fuel higher. So there are elements of the carbon price that have been geared towards trying to mitigate some of those effects. You see that on the schedule if you're filling out your income tax return. There's at least in the provinces that are subject to it. There's a higher rebate if you're outside a census metropolitan area than there is, for example, if you're in an urban center. There's also favorable pricing for farm diesel and so on. So those are elements, but we have said in our report that the federal government has not done enough to address inequalities, and that could include Indigenous people, people in small and medium businesses, including, for example, many people in agriculture and rural areas. So if the government does respond with an action plan to our recommendation to better address those inequalities, then that should help level the burden. That's up to the government. We've highlighted it as an issue, and your question raises a good issue about that. We would like them to not only assess the burden and to even the playing field, but also to report publicly on that so that people can have a source of information as to whether their efforts to, for example, provide a larger rebate in some areas versus others, whether that's actually enough or that's just getting them partway there. So that's recommendation 79 in the carbon pricing report, if you'd like to look into that further.
Just on that note, with recommendation 79, I was wondering about the way that the carbon tax is actually flowing funds, because the government talks a lot about how it goes from higher earners to poorer households. But I'm wondering if the funding is also moving funds from rural Canada to urban Canada. We know that the carbon levy does have that 10% bump up in rural Canada, but it's not quite clear how the government came up with that. I'm wondering if you feel like that actually covers the added cost for rural Canada, or if rural and Indigenous communities are getting the short end of the stick here.
We believe that there is a disproportionate impact, for example, in the three areas we talk about in the report in terms of Indigenous communities, small and medium-sized businesses. It could extend further than that, as you've mentioned in your question. So if they do what we've recommended in recommendation 79 and actually do an assessment, so you can put in a 10% bump up, for example, but is that enough to compensate for the increased costs because of the distances people travel or the fuels that are being used in a rural area or a northern area, for example. So we were asking them to do that calculation, check whether it adds up, and to report publicly on it. So that's something that maybe later today you could ask the departments as to what specifically they are going to do to reduce these inequalities so that the burden is shared and it's not disproportionately put at the feet of certain groups.
Our next question is from Alex Ballingal.
Hey, thank you very much. Just sort of related to that, I guess, on the just transition aspect of this, you mentioned in your opening remarks, and I'm hoping you can expand on it, that if I understood you correctly anyways, that you know, without actual further action to have policies to soften the transition or make it a quote unquote just transition, the risk for fossil fuel workers is akin to the cod fishery collapse. If I heard you correct, I wondered if you could just expand on you know the consequences or the you know, I guess the negative economic impacts that people in the sector could face without the supports you're talking about in a just transition.
Yes, it's interesting to see certain themes come up across our reports over the years. And long before I was in the Office of the Auditor General, there was a report on the cod fishery, and that's Exhibit 1 in that report. In today's report, we go back, and interestingly, in 1993, Auditor General des Hôtels had recommended that Canada have a legislative base for dealing with transitions, abrupt transitions, or abrupt or otherwise, in terms of economic transitions. That recommendation was not implemented by the federal government, and now here we are today, 7 years after the Paris Agreement, where we have Canada committing to a just transition, and even with that international agreement, we still don't have legislation in place for these sorts of transitions. So, you know, the circumstances are not identical between the cod fishery and the move towards net zero. But to the extent that certain communities and workers and classes of workers are directly affected, then there are commonalities. You know, we could identify in the report for coal, for example, the very specific provinces and communities and the number of workers directly employed by that, something that you could do similarly with the cod fishery back in 1993. Other parts of the just transition that are to come, they may not be as easily, I would say, compartmentalized into exact communities, because there'll be changes that are not just like, you know, turning off a coal plant or closing down a thermal coal mine. There'll be other transitions that may be more diffuse across the country. But to the extent that there are elements that are like the cod fishery, where you could identify specific communities and specific classes of workers that are going to lose their jobs, it's very important to be proactive and open the door for them in the ways that I explained with the various supports that I summarized earlier in French. Open the door for them at the same time or even earlier than closing the door on, for example, coal. There's still that opportunity for some aspects of the coal transition that are to come in Atlantic Canada, and there'll be more opportunities, but very slow off the mark in terms of the just transition, and they're just making their work harder for themselves, because they'll generate debate and discontent if they close doors without opening them at the same rate.
And just on another issue, on the carbon price, I'm wondering if you can talk about, you know, you talk about how Ontario, the feds accepted their weaker industrial carbon price or version of the industrial carbon price. Does that raise issues of competitiveness between provinces, where it's now, because of that, easier to do business with a lighter carbon price burden in Ontario for certain factories or whatever than it would be in another province with the federal OBPS? Did you guys look at that, and what are the consequences of something like that?
Yes, so there's you know, the exemptions from the large emitters were were put in place to address international competitiveness and to avoid carbon leakage. But we also do talk about in Exhibit 5.2 of that report the fact that there are interprovincial differences in the system. So one of the downsides of having a patchwork of systems like we have in Canada is that emissions coverage, for example, could be very different from one province to the other. I'm looking at the exhibit right now, and the emissions coverage, the portion of emissions covered by pricing, ranges from 54% to 87%. So you could see that sort of interprovincial competitiveness occurring because there may be an incentive for certain provinces to try to attract investment by having lower coverage in their large programs, so that large emitter program. So that's why the federal government needs to be quite diligent in ensuring that even if there is a patchwork, that they are equally effective and that the coverage rate is very close to being the same. Otherwise, you could have that the concerns that you've raised there. So I would direct you to Exhibit 5.2 of Report 5 today.
Thank you. Our next question is from Palak Mankat.
Oh, hi, Commissioner. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for taking our questions. I just want to focus on the greening government strategy involving the Treasury Board. Your team found that progress on reporting emissions has waned throughout the years, and the TSB reported a total cut across two out of three scopes of emissions, but didn't report on the third, which I believe is indirect emissions from most departments and Crown Corps. Can you talk about maybe the risk of this moving forward and maybe estimates of the scope of Canada's overall emissions here that we might be missing, or maybe that we might expect is attributed to groups like Crown Corps?
Yeah, so the greening government strategy is part of Canada's attempt to be a leader in greening government operations. And, the federal government, including the Crown corporations, is a major employer, one of probably the biggest employer in Canada, in fact. So this is a big operation. So, even if you think, it's only 2 megatons out of 600 or 700 megatons in Canada, that amongst firms, amongst organizations, that's one of the bigger employers in Canada. So they have these direct emissions, as you talked about, and indirect emissions. So we're seeing a good trend on direct emissions of a drop of about 40.6 in direct emissions from the 27 departments that were tracked. But there's two big things missing, and this constitutes the majority of the federal government's emissions. The two things that are missing are indirect emissions from those departments, as well as Crown corporations and so on. And Crown corporations writ large, they're just asked in the strategy to voluntarily report, and we don't have any quality information on their emissions. So happy that they're seeing a 40% in the small portion of the pie that they've been tracking. What's happening with the indirect emissions across government, and what's happening with the Crown corporations, which are large enterprises like Canada Post and TMX? So we would like to see them look at all of government and address all of the emissions, direct and indirect, departmental, and Crown corporations.
I have a follow-up.
Yes?
Yeah, and I know that just on that note, I know a gap in the strategy that you're also pointing to right now is that it doesn't require the TSB to report on emissions from those Crown Corps, but just encourages them to do so on their own accord. I guess naturally, is that something that you see as maybe an easy fix here? And just sort of drilling down to the problem in I'm curious, do you envision that there might be a problem in getting uptake from Crown Corps on this front, or is it sort of a capacity issue in getting enough TSB staff to actually bring Crown Corps into the fold here? I'm just curious about what the issue there is.
Yeah, so you've highlighted an interesting issue. Out of all of the 5 reports today, I'm very pleased that even if the results weren't good in terms of some of the government programs, such as just transition, that the recommendations were agreed to completely, except one. And that's the one that you're talking about right now. And Treasury Board of Canada only partially agreed about developing an approach to track overall costs and savings for the greening government strategy. So there seems to be a reluctance there to fully embrace comprehensive tracking and reporting of federal government operations. Now, if it wants to be the national and international leader in greening government operations, clearly it has to roll up that information and provide Canadians and parliamentarians with a full picture as to what costs and savings they're getting and what actual emissions reductions they're getting on direct and indirect emissions, crown corporations, and regular departments. So they have some work to do there. I'm very surprised that they didn't fully agree with that recommendation, and you can pose a question to the minister or the secretariat as to why. It's something that I would have thought the center of government would have been able to do is to even if it's asking each department to do their own thing, to at least roll up the information to have one essential balance sheet for the green operations, like we have a balance sheet and a budget for the fiscal side of our work.
Thanks, Commissioner. Since we have still a little bit more time with you, I'm wondering if you have any time to take any further questions from the room, or if anyone has another question on Zoom. But David, you raised your hand, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to follow up a little bit. I want to come back to just transition, Commissioner. Just from reading your report, it seems that a big reason NRCan and other government departments have not really done a lot of work in this area is because of COVID-19. Do you buy that as a legitimate excuse as to why things might have stalled, things might not have been as quick as you would have liked to have seen?
No, I don't buy that. The just transition was in the Paris Agreement in December 2015. And as I mentioned, the Auditor General des Hotels in 1993 said we should have legislation to deal with transitions like the cod fishery back then. So if the will had been there, they could have got a lot further along on this. They weren't surprised. It was the federal government in 2016 that announced that they were going to go towards the coal phase out. So they couldn't be caught by surprise by an international agreement that they signed and then a program that they put into place. So I don't buy that. And I'll link this report to the Emissions Reduction Fund report from last fall that some of you may have reported on. We've had this commitment to just transition from at least 2015 in the Paris Agreement, and we've had notice to the federal government from itself that it was going to be phasing out coal. So they knew that there wasn't just an abstract notion, it was something concrete. During COVID, they didn't work on the just transition anymore. They switched gears and came up from scratch with a $600 to $700 million subsidy for the fossil fuel industry during COVID. So they chose to redirect their resources towards direct payments to industry during COVID and put a pause on just transition. That's a choice they made. It wasn't just something that happened to them.
And just to follow up, I guess, typically when you think about an auditor, which your department falls under, the Auditor General of Canada, they are backward looking. But a lot of your reports are looking into the future. For example, we don't have just transition legislation. We have a hydrogen strategy, and a lot of your criticism is based on modeling of emissions that will happen in the future. So I'm just wondering, it's not a criticism, and I'm not passing any judgment, but possibly do you think you're stepping out of line by looking at future scenarios and information as opposed to looking back in the past at what the government has or hasn't done?
Well, not surprisingly, I'm going to answer that. No, I don't think I'm stepping out of line, but I'll give you more than that rather than just an assertion. So my role is in the Auditor General Act and in the Net Zero Act and in the Federal Sustainable Development Act. It's not purely about auditing past performance. I'm to bring to Parliament's attention anything to do with the environment and sustainable development that warrants consideration. So the choice today, which was made over a year ago, to look at 5 programs that were midstream as opposed to getting towards the end, sunsetting and getting towards the end, was was intentional because you'll recall last fall, even though we were quite critical about the government's track record over 3 decades, every one of those lessons learned had opportunities for improvement. So the idea behind my approach to the commissioner's role is to be a commissioner of the environment and sustainable development, not a coroner of the environment and sustainable development. We don't have mulligans or planet B to deal, to try this again in the future. If we're going to get this right, I'd rather tell them midstream what they could do to improve rather than to wait and do here's where you went wrong. So it's a different approach. And we'll still do, retrospective forensic type audits and so on, and we'll have some coming up in the fall. This bundle of 5 climate reports I was quite intentional in trying to help the government achieve its objectives if it's serious about them, and that it will have no excuse 5 or 10 years from now if they don't, because they have these reports identifying their early problems with them. So that's my approach. I'd rather help them accomplish their objectives than wait until they do or they don't and just provide a report card after the fact, because we don't have a second chance to do a lot of these things. Our children are depending on us to get this right, not just to find out later why it went wrong again.
And just as we wrap up, our last question will go to Valérie Gamache from Radio-Canada.
Est-ce que vous êtes optimiste, vous, maintenant que vous avez signé ces 5 rapports-là, est-ce que vous êtes optimiste que le Canada pourra atteindre ses objectifs ou non?
Alors, s'ils veulent, ils peuvent. Alors, ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est impossible à faire. Nous sommes le seul pays dans le G7 qui a des émissions qui ont augmenté depuis 1992 à Rio, quand la Convention de changement climatique a été signée par le Canada et les autres pays. Alors, d'autres pays ont réussi à abaisser leurs émissions. Alors, on sait que c'est possible autre part. Canada est unique dans un sens, mais ce n'est pas unique complètement. Alors, oui, c'est possible. La question, c'est vraiment s'ils vont faire ce qu'ils ont dit qu'ils vont faire. Ou est-ce qu'on va avoir des excuses? Ça, c'est l'histoire de les 3 décennies de 1990 à maintenant. Est-ce qu'on va avoir de l'action et des résultats ou est-ce qu'on va avoir des excuses? Ils peuvent faire ce qu'ils doivent faire. La question est ce qu'ils vont faire. Qu'est-ce qu'ils doivent faire?
Et croyez-vous que le gouvernement est sérieux dans sa démarche quand vous analysez donc les programmes qui ne fonctionnent pas? Avez-vous l'impression que le gouvernement est tout de même sérieux là-dedans?
Le gouvernement est quoi?
Est-ce que le gouvernement est sérieux dans sa démarche?
Est-ce que vous pouvez expliquer?
I would say, is the government serious in its way to tackle climate change?
Yeah, so I can report on their progress. Oh, je peux publier des rapports en leurs résultats et leurs programmes, leurs intentions. Vous avez besoin de demander le ministère et les ministres leurs intentions. Je veux donner l'information qu'ils ont besoin de faire ce qu'ils ont besoin de faire. S'ils décident de faire autre chose, c'est à eux pour le demander pourquoi c'est le cas.
Thank you. This will end our press conference. Ceci termine la conférence de presse.
Thank you. Role in statute, but you have an accountability, a role in ensuring government accountability every day that you're doing the work that you do. So thank you for coming.